Hello, fellow philosophers and sophists. My name is Miranda Hewlett, and I am going to present for you my lesson titled Is Knowledge Knowable? An analysis of Plato's Theaetetus. Theaetetus is a frame story, meaning it's a story within a story. So on the larger external story, the frame story is featuring Euclides and Terpsian. So Euclides, famous mathematician, also wrote a lot about this time period. We'll touch on that a little bit more later. But basically, the two men come together. Euclides mentions that he's been away because he was walking with Theaetetus, who's been carried back to Athens after a serious battle wound and illness after a battle of Corinth. After they talk about Theaetetus's character and that Socrates had always thought highly of him, Euclides is reminded of a dialogue that he transcribed of a conversation between Socrates, Theaetetus, and Theaetetus' geometry teacher, Theodorus, several years ago when Theaetetus was a young student. So Euclides calls upon his slave to read the dialogue out loud to himself and Terpsian because he says it's way too long and detailed for him to recall from memory, but he has it written down and he would like to share it with Terpsian. This frame story ultimately lends itself right into what is presented as Euclides' written dialogue of the story of Theaetetus, the dialogue that happened between Theaetetus, Theodorus, and Socrates years earlier. Now, isn't it true that to learn is to become wiser about the thing that one is learning? So let's talk a little bit about knowledge. Actually, we're going to talk a lot about knowledge or epistemology, which is the cornerstone of this particular dialogue. The definition of knowledge evolves throughout this dialogue. So I have the definitions labeled as D1, D2, and D3 because Socrates and Theaetetus actually put forward three different potential definitions of what is knowledge. So we will talk through what those are just so you can glean that idea from this piece. The first definition of knowledge is perception. And you may recall this from our studying of Protagoras earlier in the semester. So, what we see or perceive with our senses is what we know, and therefore is what is true to us. You might also have heard of this referred to as relativism, meaning that knowledge is relative. It is relative to the one who is perceiving. There are some parallels to Protagoras and the quote, man is the measure of all things, which is actually spoken by Socrates in this dialogue. And I'm also going to harken back to the allegory of the cave, which we saw in the Republic, Book 7. So here is a nice image that represents the allegory of the cave. Just as a quick refresher, there are prisoners over here on the left who are chained up and kept from turning their heads. Basically, all they can see is the shadows displayed on the wall in front of them, and those shadows represent their perception of reality. So you can see how this could equate to knowledge is perception. So what they see is what they know, and that is their reality. The man who exits the cave, so the one who escapes or is dragged out or somehow gets to the outside, depending on your interpretation, he, once his eyes adjust, sees the world for what it actually is. And he sees what Socrates calls the true forms. So he's not seeing a representation of things that are real, he's seeing the things that are actually real. And Socrates calls that truth or the good. So, what is actually true. But when he goes back in to tell his fellow prisoners about what he saw, they are very resistant. And depending on the interpretation, they either say that they will kill anyone who tries to take them outside, or that they might kill the person who is reporting this alternate reality. So, very, very resistant to changing the reality that they know through their own perception. And in this way, Protagoras is right. Man is the measure of all things. Man uses perception to gauge and interpret reality. Perception, though, can provide inaccurate representations of reality. as we see in the allegory of the cave. Those are copies of the true forms, which is why Socrates uses this allegory as a teaching tool. The part that's a little bit interesting is the extreme reaction that we see from the prisoners. So it's not just a comparison between the enlightened and the unenlightened, but it's also a representation of how fiercely the unenlightened will defend their ignorance or defend their perceptions of reality and be resistant to the perceptions of others in altering that sense of reality. And the fact that they are driven to violence, either to kill the messenger who's reporting that there's a different world outside, or to kill any who attempts to drag them outside. I think it's representative of the time period, the fact that violence was more of a commonplace scenario in day-to-day life in ancient Greece than it might be for us today. But it also indicates the fierceness with which one will adhere to their perceptions and that knowledge of their perception brings to them. So Socrates makes this connection by pointing out that it's a philosopher's job to be the enlightened one. The philosopher is the one who is aware of the true forms and is thus responsible for dwelling amongst the unenlightened and help to work to guide them toward what would be true knowledge. Enlightenment represents knowledge of what is true, or what Socrates called the good. So he definitely makes a distinction between what is true or what is real and what one knows through perception alone, which could be a misconception. This concept of relativism is what comes from Protagoras, this idea that man is the end, that what man perceives is what is reality. It is possible for two or more people to experience the same thing, such as the wind blowing on their skin, and to interpret that stimulus differently. So one might say the wind is cold, one might say the wind is warm, but neither of those can be facts because they are relative to interpretation, according to Socrates' belief. So we see here this quote at the bottom: the knowledge is to be found not in the experiences, but in the process of reasoning about them, about those experiences. It is here, seemingly not in the experiences, that it is possible to grasp being and truth. So the experience or the perception is not enough. So our first attempt to explain or to define knowledge is through knowledge as perception. As we can see, Socrates wasn't very happy with that definition and provides much to refute it. So, in the end, he considers this disproven. Perception of reality may be inaccurate of true reality. So, Protagoras' view would require the acceptance that every view is equally valid. So, this would indicate that the prisoners who only see shadows are just as correct about reality as the prisoner who saw the outside world. And both Socrates and Theodorus agree that this concept of conflicting truths being simultaneously valid is ridiculous. Sorry, Protagoras. Socrates does allow for the fact that he might be misinterpreting Protagoras. So he does admit that he might not be the best person to defend Protagoras' theories. The conclusion, however, is drawn that knowledge requires truth and accuracy. So therefore, perception alone cannot define knowledge. Knowledge must be accurate, must be true. So let's look at the next definition of knowledge: true judgment. So this premise states that both true and false judgment exist. So people can make mistakes. Therefore, knowledge is represented by true judgment. That is, people not making mistakes. Theaetetus says knowledge is true judgment. Judging truly is at least something free of mistakes, and everything that results from it is admirable and good. So let's look at knowledge as true judgment. Socrates says, the art of the greatest representatives of wisdom, the men called orators and lawyers. These men, I take it, use their art to produce conviction, not by teaching people, but by making them judge whatever they themselves choose. Or do you think there are any teachers so clever that within the short time allowed by the clock, they can teach adequately to people who were not eyewitnesses the truth of what happened to people who have been robbed or assaulted? No, I don't think they possibly could, but they might be able to persuade them. So this is a quote from Theaetetus. You'll notice the picture down in the bottom of a Greek orator. With this passage, Socrates posits that rhetoric, which is the art of persuasion, is different from teaching or from instruction, yet it can also lead an audience to draw conclusions about what is true. So, talking about someone being able to persuade someone else as to what is true, that is different from knowing the truth. Another example of true judgment could be in a simple guessing game. If you put an item like a toy in one of your hands and close both of your hands and put them behind your back, and then ask your child or your little brother or sister to guess which hand has the toy in it. If the child guesses correctly and you show them the toy, that is true judgment. But would you call it knowledge? Let's see. Knowledge is true judgment? Nope. Socrates says, suppose a jury has been justly persuaded of some matter which only an eyewitness could know, and which cannot otherwise be known. Suppose they come to their decision upon hearsay, forming a true judgment, then they have decided the case without knowledge, but granted they did their job well, being correctly persuaded. So the idea here is that even in a trial where a jury is present, the jury was not present in the room when the crime took place, yet they are asked to make a decision about the guilt of the accused. And what he's pointing out here is that they could have done that if true judgment is the same thing as knowledge, but it must be that they are different things. And the reason that he points that out is, again, it would be possible for a jury to make a wrongful conviction, but also they are doing so based on persuasion alone. So he is sort of hinting at perception again, right? That the jury, even if they come to a true conviction, being that the person who is convicted of a crime did actually commit said crime, uh, that they still didn't have knowledge of whether or not that was true. That's his argument. So, because they are being persuaded to believe, that is what makes knowledge is true judgment, not a definition of knowledge itself. Because true judgment does not necessarily mean that the jury knows what is true. So let's go on to the next one, which is knowledge is judgment with account. In this third definition, we have two things going on: true judgment, which is the ability to ascertain what is true or accurate, added with the ability to show your work. And what happens in this section is that Socrates and Theaetetus are going to work together rather hard to figure out what it means to be with account. So, how do you show your work or prove that you actually know something? So, Socrates says, now, when a man gets a true judgment about something without an account, his soul is in a state of truth as regards that thing, but he does not know it. For someone who cannot give and take an account of a thing is ignorant about it. But when he has also got an account of it, he is capable of all this and is made perfect in knowledge. So, once again, we're referring back to that true knowledge is not adequate, because true knowledge means you have the right answer, but you don't really know whether it's right. You don't know how you got it. So, it's just as good as guessing or being swindled into choosing that answer. Socrates indicates how true judgment may become knowledge when the person is able to give an account. I am calling that showing their work or showing their receipts for how they came upon that conclusion, like supporting evidence, just like you might be asked to do if you were writing. So he actually breaks it down into three different definitions of account. He says, first of all, he's really excited. He says, Theaetetus, can it be that all in this moment you and I today have laid hands upon something which many a wise man has searched for in the past and gone gray before he found it? Super excited that he has figured out the definition of knowledge. But then he realizes he hasn't, because he's not sure that judgment with account is fully explained. So now they're going to jump into, what does account mean? So, the first attempt to define the word account is to make one's thoughts apparent vocally by means of words and verbal expression. So, I can explain why this answer is correct. He dismisses this as universally present, regardless of the source of true judgment. He says, no matter how you came upon that answer, you're going to be able to make your thoughts known. You're going to be able to say, this is why I think it's right, or this is where it came from. So just the fact that you're able to say where it came from doesn't necessarily make it accurate. Therefore, it doesn't necessarily make it knowledge. So let's try again. The definition of account number two It is this man who has passed from mere judgment to expert knowledge, and he has done so in virtue of having gone over the whole by means of the elements. In this case, he uses an analogy of a cart that is made of wood, and it says that the cart is made up of all of these parts, including 100 pieces of wood. So he says that, here we go. So the person who has true knowledge is the one that has gone through, gone like taken this cart apart, gone through it piece by piece, and has itemized every piece that make up the whole or the sum of the cart. That must be what it means to be able to take an account of what your true judgment is. Well, no, now they dismiss this as well. It says it's not knowledge. A child might understand, for example, the letters of the alphabet, but miscalculate how to spell a name. So just because you can identify the elements does not necessarily mean that you understand the whole or that you know the whole. So there's the example that he actually refers back to Theaetetus and says, do you remember when you were learning the alphabet and you were trying to spell people's names? And he talks about syllables. So he gives two different examples of a name and says, isn't it possible that when you were a kid learning how to spell that you might have spelled this first syllable THE and you might have spelled this one TE and you thought you were right and you understood the letters? And he's like, yeah, that's totally possible. He's like, well, dang it, that means that this doesn't work for a definition of account, because being able to itemize the parts does not necessarily mean that you have knowledge of the whole. Number 3 on the definition of account. Number 3 says being able to tell some mark by which the object you are asked about differs from all other things. So in this case, he talks about, how do I know Theaetetus? So if I just started giving you a list of qualities like eyes, nose, head, various limbs of the body, how do I know that that's Theaetetus? And Theaetetus is like, you don't. Those are generic human qualities. And he's like, well, then how do I know an individual? How do I pull out a specific piece of knowledge out of everything that is known? He's like, well, you have to be able to identify what is different about that thing in order to have knowledge of it. So, what makes this person Theaetetus and not any other person? So he says that must mean what we mean by account. You must be able to tell what is different about this particular idea or person or concept as compared to every other concept. That's what makes you know it. You're able to identify it. He rather sadly dismisses this as well as redundant, because he realizes, oh my gosh, I have the definition of the word in my definition, because I am saying that in order to know something, you have to know something else. And so, Theaetetus, knowledge is neither perception nor true judgment, nor an account added to true judgment. Womp womp. And this is how it ends. This is called an aporia, which means ending at an impasse or without a conclusion. This was our evolution of the definition of knowledge, and it's kind of all up in the air again. And I can't help but notice personally, it does seem to come back to perception, in the sense that knowledge is defined by the perceiver. I do notice myself that we do seem to kind of fold back to, well, Socrates believes knowledge exists, yet he can't define it. Does that mean it's indefinable? That is a hard thing for Socrates to grasp. Does it mean that there are varied definitions of knowledge? Yeah, we see that happen. There are at least 3 that happen in the course of just this one dialogue. So does that take us back to perception? That knowledge is perception. And perhaps was Protagoras talking about this in a less simplistic way, in the sense that how could you possibly define knowledge outside of what the individual perceives to be knowledge? How could you define it outside of that? And the allegory of the cave also hints at this, that perception is critical to knowledge. And perhaps the difference and what the role of the philosopher is not necessarily to get everyone on the same page of the same true judgment, but to help with continued learning. At the end of the slide, you'll find a link to my complete works cited if you would like to see all of those citations. And thank you for your time. Hit me up on the discussion board, or you can email me here, and you are welcome to look through this slideshow at your leisure. I have included it posted along with this video. Take care.